The British pound plunged to a 30-year low, and world stock markets convulsed on the news that the majority of UK voters want out of the European Union, the second largest economy in the world. And while it's Britain's decision, it will be the entire world economy that absorbs the shock. Joining us now to consider what comes next, in London, UK, Megan Green, Chief Economist, Manulife Asset Management. And here in studio, Bruce Cooper, Chief Investment Officer, TD Asset Management, and Brian Milner, Senior Economics Writer and Global Markets Columnist at the Globe and Mail. Well, this is a shocking day, I suspect, for many, many people. I want to start by playing a clip of one person whose smile could not have been broader this morning. He is the leader of the UKIP party in Great Britain, and he says the country has saved itself from Brussels. Roll the clip.
If the predictions now are right, this will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, a victory for decent people. We have fought against the multinationals, we fought against the big merchant banks, we fought against big politics, we fought against lies, corruption and deceit, and today, honesty, decency and belief in nation, I think now is going to win.
Nigel Farage of the UKIP party. Megan, to you first. How much of any of what he just said do you think is accurate?
Very little of it, actually. Nigel Farage is a classic populist, and I do think that Brexit is one piece in a much larger puzzle that we're seeing across the Western world, whereby we have a really slow economic recovery, and that's great fertile ground for populists like Nigel Farage, but other politicians across Europe and also in the US. So he's playing to this isolationist, anti-immigrant, anti-globalization, anti-elite feeling that is actually sweeping across the Western world.
You're there in the thick of it, Megan. How, I don't know, pick the word you like. How shocked, how bewildered were you with the results?
I knew it would be really close, but I did think that Remain would just eke it out, and of course the opposite has happened. The markets today absolutely tanked, and that was no surprise. Trading volumes were really thin. Well, we'll have to wait a few days to figure out how much of that market adjustment will be sustained, but I think the much bigger risks are probably in the medium to long term. I think this not only poses an existential threat to the UK, Scotland might choose to leave, Ireland might decide to reunite with Northern Ireland, but more importantly, I think it poses an existential threat to the EU. So this is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the last EU referendum that we'll see in Europe.
Brian Milner, I'm hearing comparisons made to the fall of the Berlin Wall. I am hearing comparisons made to the Cuban Missile Crisis. That this is that big in terms of world history. Do you agree?
Even the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. They are even going back to the 1600s to describe this thing. It is a major event. There's no getting around that fact. But the fact is that a lot of what we're seeing is not a vote against belonging to a broader organization called the EU. It's a vote against political elites in these individual countries as much as anything. And more to the point, it's a problem that the EU itself has fostered by becoming less democratic than it should have been, by taking on more of a political role than it was originally designed to hold. And that was part of the strategy of the leaders of the EU. They really do believe in a federation, basically, with a single government, and their hope was to get there through the economies. And that hasn't worked because of the economic problems that we're seeing throughout the Union.
So they pushed too far, too fast?
Absolutely, including with the creation of the euro, which Britain didn't join, but set the stage for everything we're seeing now.
Bruce, I want to know what it was like showing up for work this morning.
Well, it's been a volatile day, for sure. You know, we saw a big correction down off the start, of course, but it's actually, you know, settled in. So North American markets, while they're down, I think on the U.S. Stock market, we're down to levels we saw as recently as a week ago. You know, so we've pulled back a little bit off relatively high levels. The real damage has been done to the pound at European equities as opposed to North American equities.
How much wealth do you think went up in smoke in seconds?
Yeah, I haven't got the number, but it would, you know, billions and billions of dollars for sure. It's big money.
Were you guys prepared for this eventuality?
Well, we've been of the mindset that we live in a very low growth world, and that this was going to be a volatile and low return year. So in that sense, we were prepared. We actually didn't expect that they would vote for Brexit, but we expected volatility for other reasons. And so in that sense, we were set up pretty well for this.
Megan, here are some of the facts involved. The pound has lost 10% since the results have been announced, the lowest value in more than 30 years. The Dow was off, I think, 500 points within 2 minutes after the market opened. I wonder whether the Canadian-born Mark Carney, governor of the Bank of England, can do anything about this.
Well, I think he absolutely can. In fact, when he gave a press conference this morning, I thought he was providing some of the only leadership, really, that we have in the UK. And Mark Carney has come out in concert, with other central bank governors saying that they will provide liquidity to UK banks. And a lot of people are making a comparison between Brexit and Lehman, and I actually think that's a really flawed comparison. You know, we're very shocked by Lehman, genuinely, whereas we're all suffering from what people here are calling Brexhaustion. We've been talking about Brexit forever. And banks have really created detailed contingency plans. Most of us thought that Remain would probably just eke it out, so we're a bit surprised, but most companies have actually positioned themselves. We have swap lines in place between central banks, and we know how to use them now, whereas we didn't in 2008. So I do think that Mark Carney can actually help a lot in providing liquidity to banks, and I think in the first instance, that's the only policy response that we'll see. In the medium to long term, I think, once again, the Bank of England will lead the way and will probably ease monetary policy further. So the UK, unlike most other central banks, has some room to cut rates. But more importantly, they could end up using helicopter money, which is a permanent transfer from central banks to households, to create demand in the face of the draw on growth in the UK as a result of falling economic sentiment.
Just a little follow-up here. What's helicopter money?
So helicopter money is a permanent transfer from central banks to households, so it bypasses the banking system. Now, quantitative easing goes through the banking system and isn't permanent, so there is a big difference. It can take a lot of different forms. Often it's in the form of tax rebates, but in theory, a central bank could just deposit money into people's bank accounts and say you need to spend it in the next few months or you lose it. And it's a surefire way to create demand. So it is a way to get the economy going in the face of a huge headwind like the one that the UK is now facing.
Interesting.
A very temporary solution that doesn't seem to ever work in the longer term whenever it's tried.
Has it been tried?
Well, there's been talk of doing it in Japan, but the fact is that everything else they've tried in Japan doesn't work. So then they say, well, maybe if we just dump cash out of helicopters, which is where that came from. Originally came from Milton Friedman, who said you might as well do that because it's easier to trigger an economic recovery doing that. But the fact is that no, as an economic strategy, it's something the central banks really don't want to do any more than negative interest rates, but they have done that, so who knows?
I don't know, Bruce, whether you heard these rumors this morning, but it was reported that Morgan Stanley is musing about moving 2,000 positions out of London, either to Frankfurt or Dublin. Company denies it, says the bank has no immediate plans to make changes. But what do you think the events of the last 24 hours do to London's position as, if not the premier, certainly one of the premier world money spots?
Yeah, I think it could threaten it. You know, I was at a lunch with Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of JP Morgan, about a month ago, and he said if the UK votes to leave, as they've now done, that he would move positions out of London to somewhere else in Europe, whether it was, he didn't say whether it be Frankfurt or Paris or Dublin.
And why would he do that?
Well, I think the idea is there'd be certain transactions and roles that'd be easier from a regulatory perspective if you're still inside the EU. Of course, today, they don't really know how that's going to unfold because the negotiations of the exit are going to take 2 years. But they'd be sort of anticipating that once the negotiations were done, whatever the framework was put in place, it would be easier to do certain things if you're inside the EU, so they want to get ahead of that and move some jobs first. We'll see if it happens, but certainly you referenced Morgan Stanley. They're not the only ones that have talked about that. Yeah, and I think it's reasonable to expect that London's place as a financial center could be impaired a little bit. I suspect it'll still be a very, very important financial center, but this is not going to help.
Megan, you're there in the thick of it. How concerned are you about London's position in this world economic market?
Well, it really depends on what model the UK ends up following. So there is a chance that the UK could adopt Norway's model, which means it would remain in the single market. And so any banks who are based in London would have access to the EU. That's the best option for the UK. But part of the Norway model is also to have workers come from the EU to the UK. And of course, the Vote Leave campaign, one of their main arguments was that they don't want EU migrants coming to the UK. So what's the point of following that model if they're undermining one of their main points? So it's not a slam dunk that they'll choose that model. And if they choose any other models, like the Turkey model or the Switzerland model, or if they decide to throw out all the models and just have their trade relationships dictated by WTO rules, then I think a lot of banks will probably move from London, or at the very least will also establish big centers somewhere in the EU, because then they'll have access to the EU market, which of course will be much bigger than the UK market.
We should add that right now financial services firms in London, headquartered in London, can do transactions anywhere in the EU. They have a passport that allows them to do M&A, they can bid on government
mergers
deals,
and acquisitions.
Everything. They can do whatever they want in any EU country. Once you leave the EU, you lose that privilege, and you have to renegotiate that. The Swiss banks were never able to do that, even though Switzerland negotiated free trade. They couldn't negotiate a financial services deal because the French and Germans didn't want Swiss banks stealing their lunch.
How confident, Megan, are you that these British institutions will be able to renegotiate their way back into that special status, even if Britain is outside the EU?
Well, I'm not sure that they'll want to, because once again, they want to close their borders to other EU migrants, and so that comes with costs, and they might have to give up this financial services passport. But on top of that, Prime Minister Cameron said that he's resigning today, and they hope to have a new Prime Minister in place in September, so they'll invoke Article 50, which is the legal framework for them to actually leave the EU, probably in October. But we'll have a new leadership having to negotiate with all of the UK's trading partners. And on top of that, today we woke up to the most divided society that I've ever seen, actually. And that was going to be the case no matter who won, because it was so close. But we're going to have a new leader. There will be political instability. We don't know who the leader will be yet. Even there will be a competition for that. They'll be facing massive economic uncertainty. And on top of that, they're going to have to try to unite society or face social unrest. So this new government will have a number of challenges, and trying to negotiate in the midst of that is a really tall order.
Brian, I know we're focusing on the financial tonight, but I do want to ask one political question, and I'll put it to you. This was the most spectacular miscalculation by probably any prime minister on any issue ever. Is that fair to say?
Well, it's certainly fair to say that he did a lousy job of selling something that he claims to have believed in. I'm not sure it was a spectacular miscalculation on his part, because it was really the only way he could preserve his job. There's been a lot of talk that coming into the election he was worried about UKIP and the far right stealing part of his vote, and he'd be left with another minority government and maybe another coalition, so he had to do this. In actual fact, there were huge internal problems within his own party. There was a lot of pressure from the rank and file, especially from the part outside London, that wanted out of the EU and wanted at least to have a say in it. And that was what prompted his promise. Now, he rashly did it in the belief that he could win anything. If he won the prime ministership with a majority government, well, why not do this? I'm popular now, I can get away with this. But he sold it badly. He did a poor job of defending it, and he did a lousy job of trying to negotiate a compromise with EU leaders leading up to the referendum call. He didn't take a hard enough line to appeal to the people he was trying to win over in his own party. When your own cabinet splits over something like that, you're not doing your job.
Bruce, we've had this debate in Canada a couple of times over the last 35 years. In 1995 and before that in 1980, when we had two referenda on the future of Quebec. And presumably there's an assumption that once the people have spoken, you know, the behind-the-scenes people get together and they do the negotiating and everything just happens. I wonder how nice the negotiations are going to be, given the tightness of this result and what bitter feelings have been left over. What do you think?
Well, we're deeply into unknown territory here. You know, no one has ever left the EU. There is this Article 50 that will be invoked and that sets out a certain framework, but the negotiations are going to be exceptionally challenging. Of course, we don't even know who's going to carry out the negotiations, because the divisions start right within the Conservative Party itself. As we've already mentioned, Mr. Cameron's going to go, probably Mr. Osborne's going to go.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer. Presumably Boris Johnson, who led the Leave campaign, will take a prominent role in either negotiating or guiding the negotiations. But exceptionally divided Conservative Party, exceptionally divided society. The Europeans will have their own objectives they'll be trying to meet. Of course, they don't want to encourage other countries to leave. So they don't want to make it too easy to exit and then negotiate all the good bits back in. We've got separatists in Spain that would love to capitalize on that sort of thing. Apparently 80% of the Dutch would like to have a vote, just as we've witnessed last night in the UK. So, there's challenges on all sides. I think it's going to be a long and difficult process. Well,
Megan, that's one of the things that we also wonder is whether or not, now that we've seen a Brexit, we'll see a Frexit in France, and how contagious this will be. I presume the EU will, and I'll use this technical financial term here, will want to put the screws as hard as they can to any other, to the UK in negotiating this as a warning to other countries, no?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important questions to be asking now, and I think actually it will all depend on the market reaction. So if the market reaction that we saw today is sustained, and I don't think it probably will be, but I think that, the EU will grant the UK leniency because it's not in their best interest to have a basket case as a neighbor. If the markets back off a little bit over the next few weeks in particular, then I think actually the EU will play hardball. They'll want to prevent a moral hazard. And Geert Wilders, a populist politician in the Netherlands, it only took him a few minutes after the Leave campaign won to declare that the Netherlands wants to have a referendum. They just have to gather a certain number of signatures to make that happen. Marine Le Pen, right after that in France, she's the head of the National Front, another populist party, said they would like to have a referendum. According to a recent poll, more than half of Italians and French want to have a referendum, and almost half of them would choose to leave if given the chance. So it takes a while to put together a referendum. It'll take at least a year for any of these countries to have campaigns and have a vote. A lot can change in the meantime, but it certainly increases the risk in terms of the cohesion of the EU.
Well, Brian, if you want to look at political implications, you don't have to go overseas. Does this put wind in Donald Trump's sails?
Oh, absolutely. He's in Scotland right now, I guess surveying another golf course, and he's already said what a great move by the British to escape the shackles of this global dangerous unified group in Europe. Now they can get on with being a real country again. He's already said that. And the fact is that one thing we did not mention going into these negotiations is that both Germany and France have elections in 2017 where they face populist uprisings. They can't afford to be kind and gentle to the British and hope to quell the disputes within their own borders, never mind what the Italians might do or the Dutch. I don't think Marine Le Pen has any intention of splitting from the EU because so much of her support is rural, and they're the biggest beneficiaries of subsidies from the European Union. I think farmers would burn down her headquarters if she actually proposed it, but she can talk about it. It helps her attract votes, and that'll be a talking point in all these countries. I think what they're really afraid of in Brussels is that there won't be referendums to leave. There will be referendums on every minor change, every regulatory move they try to make. If they try to tighten financial regulation in the region, if they try to deal with the refugee crisis in a better way, you're going to have a lot of these problems showing up, and it's going to be a real problem to do anything.
Bruce, if I just build on that, I think one of the challenges is this comes at a time when global growth is already exceptionally slow, and there's a great deal of fragility around. So, if we had a choice, we wouldn't draw up on the blackboard, let's put in place this additional uncertainty. It's the last thing we need.
I know you're a capitalist, but given the track record over the last week of how the markets prepared for this, in other words, really weren't, how much can we trust the markets to get the future right?
Well, these kind of binary events are always incredibly difficult, and I would say people like myself or other market participants, we don't have any better insight, for the most part, than anybody else. So, we've got to sort of roll with events as they unfold. Our job in the end is to invest our clients' savings and to preserve and grow the real value of those savings over time and adjust to events as they unfold.
There are people wondering how much more difficult that is going to be insofar as do the events of the last 24 hours portend 2008 redux. Are we about to go into, and just because I know I see you champing at the bit to get in on that, but I want to play a clip on that first. Here's Lord Melvin King, former governor, Bank of England, speaking last March about the future of banking. Roll it.
Now, you say in your book that it's virtually certain that we're facing another financial and economic catastrophe or crash. Why is that?
Well, in the very long run, and we don't know how long that will be, the banking system is still potentially subject to the sort of runs that we saw during the crisis. No one knows when that will be. The banking system is safer now than it was before the crisis, but it's not safe enough. And what I say in the book is that we do have 10 to 20 years to put in place measures that will make our banking system much safer. In the short run, what we need to be worried about actually is the rest of the world. The euro area, which still has immense difficulties, China, which is not growing as rapidly as it claims to be, and the banking system there is in trouble. Many countries around the world are now starting to compete with each other rather than cooperate with each other.
Megan, how concerned are you that the events of last night could usher in another great recession, the likes of which we had in 2008?
Well, I think it's unlikely that we'll see something like we had in 2008, but I do think that there is a real risk that if Brexit actually results in a breakup of the EU, that could absolutely tip the world into a global recession. I think the drivers, though, are really global and not just based on Brexit, though Brexit could be a catalyst. I think we have really long business cycles now. And so as a result, when unemployment is high and we're in the economic doldrums, populists tend to do pretty well. So populists who are sometimes anti-elitist, anti-globalization, isolationist, anti-migrant. We've seen that in the Brexit campaign. We're seeing it in the US election. So this is a real global trend. And so I think that what we're looking at is a revolution of another sort, but I don't think we're looking at a brand new recession like we saw in 2008. One thing that's really struck me being in the UK is listening to everybody say, I don't know what's happening in my country. I want my country back. And as an American based in the US, I sit there quietly thinking, me too. This is a much bigger phenomenon than Brexit or the US elections.
Bruce, you on that same question about whether this ushers in a new recession?
I think there's a lot of differences between now and 08. A couple of the biggest ones from my perspective are the U.S. economy is solid. I wouldn't describe it as awesome, but it's solid. And you think about 08, that was in some cases a response to excesses that had gone on, excesses obviously in the housing market, which had been accompanied by huge amounts of debt. You know, in the last 7-8 years in the U.S., it's just been kind of steady, eddy, trundle along. Very few excesses have built up in that country. And the banking system is in much, much better shape. So I think it's unlikely we're going to have the kind of disaster we had 8 or 10 years ago. But I do think we're in for a very, very prolonged stretch of very lackluster growth. And so for a lot of people, it's not going to feel like sunshine and roses.
Okay, having said that, Brian, the U.S. economy, solid, I think was the word you used. China's not solid. China's certainly not as solid as it has been over the previous years. Does the combination of last night and China's current economic condition lead you to have any concerns about whether or not we're going to see 2008 again?
Well, I don't think we'll see an exact duplication again because banks have much stronger balance sheets, all banks. They've been required to. They didn't do it because they love it. Mark Carney addressed that this morning about British banks. He talked about how many more billions of dollars they've set aside. They have a much better cushion. I think Lord King is right. There are risks out there globally. China is a huge unknown risk because of the debt in its system and the fact that its banks have been required to do really bad practices for a long time at the behest of the government. That's a real risk to the global financial system and also to the global economy. And even if you talk about U.S. growth, it's still pretty low. We're talking about an economy barely growing at 2% with significant barriers to higher growth. There's still not a lot of recovery in certain areas. And the U.S. is about it in the developed world. Everybody else is struggling to get by with 1.5% if they're lucky. Some of them are facing deflation. In Europe, that's true. In Japan. Those are all key economic issues, but not so much financial. I do think there could be another recession any time because growth is so slow. And it's partly slow because of a real slowdown in global trade. That's a lot of China, but it's also a lot of just people not buying. And if trade slows down to where it is now, about 2% on average globally, that's critical because the average over the last 50 years was about 4.5%.
Let me pick one thing out of there that you said and put it to Megan. Brian just said that the banks are in much better shape now than they were in 2008, and therefore the conditions aren't the same, which would allow for a recession the likes of which we had in 2008. However, a couple of months ago, the IMF did have a report in which there is the quote, a third of European banks, quote, faced significant challenges. Carl Icahn, the billionaire, good friend of Donald Trump, says the public is walking into a trap again, as they did in 2007. So let me go back at this one more time. Is everybody really that sure that we're not going to have 2008 all over again?
So I am, and I think you're right. It's not all banks that are in better shape now than in 2008. U.S. banks certainly are, but a lot of European banks are definitely not, particularly Italian banks and Portuguese banks. So, even German banks aren't in as good shape as they were probably in 2008. And another risk that we haven't mentioned is that central banks have actually intervened a whole lot more now than they had in 2008. So in 2008, they had a lot of dry powder that they could use to try to boost assets and try to create price stability and support growth and employment. Now they've used most of their bullets, and so central banks don't have that many options left at their disposal. So if we were to turn into a recession once again, central banks they're much more constrained in terms of what they have left to try. I've mentioned helicopter money previously as one option, but central banks have been the only players who have actually intervened at all. What really needs to happen, I think, is that central banks stop being the only player and that governments do their part and provide some kind of fiscal stimulus to create demand as well. Unfortunately, that's really politically unpopular in the Western world, at least, so I think it's unlikely.
In our last few minutes here, let me touch on one last thing with all of you, and that is, Bruce, to you first. I guess we all got, this was a teachable moment this past week in terms of things that can happen far away from where we live and yet affect the value of our house and our investments. Advice to people tonight about the status of their RSPs and what they should do and all of that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mothered statement, but I think diversification is so important when you're building portfolios. We focus on the things that are falling today, stocks and the British pound among them, but there are also things that are up today, bonds principally, and
gold big time.
Gold big time, the US dollar. And so many of our clients for sure would have bonds as a major part of their portfolio. And so, yes, they've probably lost a little bit of money, but probably actually a lot less than they think because they've got this balance. And, never has this been more important than it is today, in my opinion. Because the range of possible outcomes, both economically and financially, is very wide. Having what we call a diversified portfolio of quality assets, absolutely crucial.
Let me get 30 seconds from Brian and then 30 seconds from Megan on this.
Well, my advice is always not to look at your portfolios during these crises, because they usually are temporary. You'll faint if you see the numbers, if you have a lot of assets tied up in British-related things or European-related assets. But the fact is that over time, that all recovers. But you do need to be diversified, and you do need to be cautious and fairly conservative and not try to get huge gains out of the market. Settle for something smaller and more manageable, and then you won't get burned as much if things go the other way.
Gotcha. Megan, last word to you.
Yeah, I would also bring up an old adage that says, don't sell today what you wish you had sold a few months ago already. So the markets have responded in a really swift, volatile way. As I mentioned earlier, trading volumes are really thin, and I don't think that all of these adjustments will be sustained. So wait it out for a few days and see where the markets end up.
Megan, last question to you. Did you and your colleagues go out and belt back a few scotches after the results came in?
No, I was up all night watching results and then was co-hosting a TV show, so there was no opportunity for that. But I was almost late to this show, actually, because in the city of London, people are just spilling out into the streets from pubs. A lot of people are drowning their sorrows today. Drowning their sorrows in London, but not so much in other places in the UK. Really good of you to join us on TVO tonight. That's Megan Green, Chief Economist of Manulife Asset Management, on the line from London, UK. Thanks, Megan. Good to see you again. Bruce Cooper, Chief Investment Officer, TD Asset Management, and Brian Milner from the Globe and Mail here in our studio. Thanks, gents.
Thanks for having us.
My pleasure.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.